Hello. In week one, we began by talking about a couple of poems. One of those poems was called I Could Ask, but I Think They Used Tweezers by Aziza Barnes. And I asked you to think a little bit about a concept called a rhetorical situation. Now, every time a writer writes or a person speaks, they're entering into what is called a rhetorical situation. It's the situation in which a piece of writing or a piece of speech is responding to. A rhetorical situation will consider the audience of the intended speech act or the piece of writing, the purpose, right? What is the intended effect on that audience, and the occasion. What is happening in the world or what is happening in the writer's life that influences the way that they choose to communicate. Now, looking at a poem and trying to determine the rhetorical situation is a little bit more complicated than looking at a piece of nonfiction, but we can still apply the same kinds of ideas. So in the poem, I could ask, but I think they use tweezers. The audience is probably a younger audience. It's probably an audience that maybe comes from an urban setting, maybe even an audience that we can say speaks with a African American vernacular. The reason that I say that is that we can zoom in on some of the lines and pay attention to the ways that the speaker communicates, the words that she chooses. In particular, we think about the act of violence that is witnessed at the McDonald's and the description of where the character lives. She says, things that don't feel like food in the mornings, down the street from my house, from his mama house. So we pay attention to really what we would say like the colloquialism or the vernacular, the way that people commonly speak. And it's important that we think about the audience as maybe being a younger audience, maybe being an urban audience, because it also ties into the purpose. Of course, we know that our author wants to reflect on a situation. She has witnessed an act of gun violence, but she's also trying to importantly highlight the fact that oftentimes victims of color are left out of the equation or are not given as much attention as victims, white victims, or other victims of violence. When we think about gun violence, we're often asked to think about mass shootings, school shootings. We think about things that can play out on a racialized landscape. So our poet Aziza Banks, again, her purpose is one to reflect on the experience of loss, but also to emphasize and to create some empathy for victims of color as well. When we think about the occasion, we can think about when the text was written, right? The poem was written in 2015. And the poem is, of course, in response to this particular event that the poet experiences, but it's also in the context of a larger wave of violence, of mass shootings, as well as more intimate violence that happens on a more intimate scale. So, thinking about the rhetorical situation is something that can help us to understand why it is that a writer creates a certain piece of writing, but also it helps us understand why it is that he or she employs the tools or techniques that are present in the piece of writing. As we move forward throughout the unit, we'll continue to look at the ways in which writers are responding to rhetorical situations. More often, we'll be looking at this with nonfiction writing.